I'm the newsroom's representative to that committee. So this is, there's an awful lot of projects we're working on related to that, and I oversee a bunch of those.
I'm Gary Rogers. I'm the editor of Radar, which is a UK project. It's a joint venture between Urbs Media, a data journalism startup, which I set up about 2 years ago, and the Press Association, which is the UK's largest national news agency. And we began a project to try to do the automation of local news stories last autumn. And so we're just getting underway.
So we wanted to talk a little bit about what it is we're going to focus on today. I mean, as mentioned, there are an awful lot of ways that journalists are exploring how to use automation and AI. What we're going to be talking today is very specifically about how do you turn structured data into text stories? And that technology is called natural language generation. And one thing, I mean, Gary and I talk a lot about this. We say writing for robots or writing by robots kind of to be funny. But one thing I think we need to make very clear is that robots don't write these stories. Journalists write the stories. It's this automation software that simply queries the data and then selects which sentences and which phrases to use in the story. But these stories are very much written by journalists. There's no robot involved there. And I think that's important to be clear about because of all the questions people have about whether robots are going to take journalists' jobs and things of that nature. No, journalists write these stories, not robots. Do you want to add anything to that?
I'm not a robot, but I use automation to write stories. And in setting up the business, the first thing I did was hire 3 reporters. So I think we're talking about tools, not about the disembodiment of reporting.
So very specifically how AP uses text automation to create stories. In 2014, we started automating the production of corporate earnings stories. My business news staff was writing 300 earnings stories per quarter. And through automation, we've been able to increase that to 3,600 stories per quarter. So most of the US stock market and some of Canada is now getting an earnings story where they did not before. We also have begun automating a lot of stories in our sports department, game recaps, sports that we did not have journalists to cover, like minor league baseball, college basketball, things of that nature. So we've been able to automate stories for things that we weren't covering before.
We started in a slightly different place. We started with looking at public data in the UK that had a large amount of geographical granularity so that we could have information about lots of small areas. But there were never enough reporters to write every version of that story, so we looked at trying to use automation to do that from the structured open data. We started last autumn. We published our first automated news story on November the 28th last year, and we've been in a pilot process, trying to build a process, trying to iterate, try to understand how to do this. So we've been operating live, as it were, for 5 months. With a small pilot group of 50 news titles across the United Kingdom. And over the last 5 months, we've had about 500 stories published so far with just a small closed group.
So why do we do this at all? I mean, as you could hear from our examples that we talked about, using automation can help us produce a volume of stories that there'd be no way that we would have enough reporters to produce all those stories. And so we can create stories that we never would have had the staff to do. Also, as Gary mentioned, this notion of producing a localized version of stories out of a big national data set. There are a lot of personalization opportunities that you can achieve through automation, creating multiple versions of the same story without taking up a reporter's time to essentially write the same story over and over again. And then for us in particular, it was a real efficiency play. Business journalists spent enormous amount of time every quarter writing corporate earnings stories that, maybe the earnings release came out at 6 a.m., maybe it came out at 5:30 p.m. It's a very time-consuming work that's essentially routine. It's the same from quarter to quarter. Sometimes there's big news, but often there isn't. And what we really wanted to do was figure out, how do we eliminate those low-value tasks from our experienced beat reporters and free them up to do more interesting, high-impact work. So for us, in general, regardless of the automation or AI technology that we're experimenting with, our view is really that it's about efficiency and liberating journalist time.
We wanted in the session to do a little bit of a deep dive here and explain more about what it is we do. If you're a journalist working in one of our operations, what is it happens on a day-to-day basis? How does this work? We're running slightly different projects here, but there's a sort of common themes to them both. As Lisa's been saying, it's about trying to generate scale, and it's been about trying to maximize reporter time. And for both of us, there's the challenge of how to get the right combination of human effort and machine effort and get those working in sync together so we get the best results. It's self-evident that we're starting with structured data and trying to get from that lots of stories to a lot of media outlets. And there are certain things that humans are just much better at than journalists. One of them is deciding which data to choose, an editorial decision about what story you're going to do. The second is excavating that story and finding those story angles in the data. Those are good human activities. And machines aren't very good at writing at the moment. Humans, they're quite good at writing. So let's keep the humans writing the stories. But let's try and find a way to bring some machine elements into this to help them along the way. Broadly, it breaks down into sort of three areas. At the start of it, there are some tools we can use to help organize our data. And at the back end of it, there's some tools we can use to help distribute the stories. Because if we're going to produce hundreds and thousands of stories, we've got to have a way to get them to the right user. This is a particular problem for our project because we're doing local news. So we don't want to send 400 versions of the same story to every person. We want to send the right version to the right media outlet. So distribution's a big challenge. But the key for both of us is this thing in the middle. It's natural language generation and the tools that we use to help write the story. This means that a reporter can use natural language generation software to write not a story, but a template for a story. And when that template is taken to try to cover every eventuality of the story, and we'll go into a little more detail in a moment about how we do that, we can then feed the data through it to produce multiple versions of that story. In Lisa's work at the AP, that's every earnings data set goes through that to produce that report. For us, slightly different. It's a new template for every new set of data. It could be a bit of health data. It could be a piece of transport data. And we'll write a template to cover that data set because at the end of it, we'll get 400 versions of the story or more. So we want to focus on NLG. Lisa.
So I just wanted to mention, in all of these cases, we identify a software company that produces, licenses the tool to build these templates. In AP's case, we use a company called Automated Insights, which again builds the user-friendly, and I say that relatively speaking. But they build the interface for journalists to create the templates. There are numerous, often I get asked the question, and I'm sure Gary does too, well, who do you use? How do you do it? So there are a few software companies like Automated Insights. There also is open source code out there available if you have an in-house engineer or developer. There are ways to create your own without going through one of these companies. So you have kind of a buy, build, or partner choice to make around how you want to do this if it's something you're considering. But this is who we've used.
We made a similar choice as the AP. We decided to, this was quite a commoditized area and we could find a commercially available software to do this. We chose NLG Studio by Aria, it's a competitor of Automated Insights. We chose that one because we found that we wanted to make this part of a journalist toolkit. This wasn't something that we wanted only possible if you had coding experience. It had to be something that a journalist could sit down at their laptop and open up this piece of software and write in that piece of software. And in playing with a few of them, we found that that suited our purposes better than the others in the market. But as Lisa says, there are many available.
So we're going to dive a little bit more into the inner mechanics of putting together one of these projects and hopefully walking through these 3 areas that we have up here on the screen. I mean, the first one, finding the data, I mean, there's nothing really that's more critical than having clean, consistent data. I mean, it's no surprise that when you hear about media doing automation projects, they're typically in the world of business, sports, weather. You're not going to hear many talking about automating political stories or, automating human interest stories I mean, robots are not good at context. And so you really, starting with the structure of the data is really key. And I'm going to show you, this is an example. One of the things that we do now that we never had to do before on AP's business desk is, in order to have accurate earnings stories every quarter produced with the help of the automation software, we need to make sure that that data is accurate and clean. So we now maintain sizable, and it's as simple as an Excel database, as you can see. I mean, this is not fancy. But we have an editor who's a big part of her job now is maintaining this database and working with our data provider to make sure it's kept up to date. Clearly, companies go out of business, they go public, they merge, they move their headquarters. There are things that happen that change essentially the data every quarter, and it's important for us, obviously, to keep that up to date, or you're going to end up with an inaccurate story at the end of the path. So this is just to give you kind of an example of what those databases look like. You can, it may be hard to see, but I mean, you can see essentially we've got, the stock ticker and the name of the company and where it's headquartered and that sort of thing. And so what you'll see now as I go to the next slide, Gary mentioned the idea of writing a template. I mean, it's so interesting, and we talk about this a lot. I mean, typically as a journalist, you're assigned a story, you go out and you find data and you do a bunch of interviews and you read up and you decide based on your reporting process, what's the story? What's the right way to write it? In the case of stories like what we're talking about, where you're producing hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of just different versions of the same story, you're actually reversing that process. You're starting with, what is that story going to look like? And now working backwards, what are the phrases and sentences we need to write based on the data that we're going to be feeding into it? So this is an example of an earnings story that's been automated. And the highlighted areas are all things that will change for each story depending on the company whose earnings we're automating. So for every one of those terms, phrases, sentences, etc., we at AP have to write what that language is going to be, organize that data in the Excel spreadsheet that I showed you before, so that when the template receives the data file, it knows what to do with it. So I have actually, this is actually from an email I sent to someone who was asking me, well, but how do you do it? And I was trying to show her You know, imagine you're starting with a story that exists. If you're figuring out how to automate it, identify which of those terms in it will need to change. And so when you go to write the templates, that's what you're doing. You know, if earnings go up, if earnings go down, if earnings are flat, what would you write as a journalist? And you need to, and that's what you build into the templates. So continuing to talk a little bit about our earnings automation project, in our case, we have a data partner, Zacks Investment Research, that actually provides the data files to us for automation. A lot of people assume that we scrape earnings releases or use other sort of AI to do that. We do not. Not to say we would never do that in the future, but at the time we launched this project, which was in 2014, we didn't believe that technology was accurate enough to produce the results we wanted. So we use Zacks Investment Research, and by the way, and this will become important later, it's human staffers at Zacks who enter this data into the structured file that then goes to the template. So humans wrote the template, humans pull the data, and then it's just the software that, based on the template, pulls the data and then generates the story that you see on the right. And that's essentially what natural language generation is. So I mentioned our main goal in doing this was to free up our journalists' time to be able to do more investigative projects. So I was business editor at the time, and we did a rough calculation that automating earnings saved a minimum of 3 full-time journalists' time that we could then deploy into other things. So we increased our technology coverage, we increased our personal finance coverage, we worked on more global investigative projects. I mean, I absolutely can draw a very direct line between automating earnings and awards we won. I mean, that is the power of being able to use these tools. And so for us, this was very powerful. We spent months plotting out the process that we were going to use for automation, which included several months of testing in which we fine-tuned the story templates, we fine-tuned the process, and the stories that were generated would essentially get sent to a private basket for our editors to review, correct, watch for problems, and figure out what we needed to do. And so we probably worked for 6 to 9 months overall on designing the system before we went live in the fall of 2014, meaning that was the first time we were sending earnings stories to the wire without a human looking at them.
We follow a similar series of steps, but are trying to do a slightly different thing in the way we're working. For a start, we've got a different starting place. So we're starting with public data in the UK. Large amounts of it published, very well structured generally, segmented geographically, so across a whole series of what would be quite traditional reporter beats: health data, transport, education, social policy, all very granular. So we take some of that. Now we could write a story about the whole of the country. So on your screen there is childhood obesity data for every local authority area in England. So there's about 320 rows of data there. So I could write one story for that whole data set, or I could try and write 320 stories, one for each of those areas. And that will be good because there are local news publications all the way around the UK, and some of them have the time to do this and to get into this data and to look for their row of data and to do their story. And some of them do not. So some of these stories may go unseen. And if I can try and help that, if I can find a centralized way to produce 320 stories, then perhaps I can help a local news market, which in the UK, like in many places, is struggling a little bit. Times are quite tough out there. There aren't enough journalists sitting in newsrooms to do all the stories they want to do and to do all the stories that their consumers want them to do. So we pick up a data sheet like that, and we do some work with it. simple data analysis to look at what are the storylines within that data sheet. It's just basic human journalism. What are the stories I'm going to tell out of this? And there may be one overarching story which applies to everybody, and there may be a number of different angles, and they apply to different areas. And I'm going to try and work all those out. And there'll always be some places that have a better story than others, because that's just the way the numbers work. There'll always be significant outliers, and significant outliers in journalism usually means there's a better story there in some way. But I'm in the scale game, I have to remember, so I'm trying to do a story for everybody. It would be interesting to do one great story, but for what I'm trying to do, it's more important to do 320 good stories. And so that's what I'm trying to do. So I'm finding the story. And then I've got to structure the data a little bit to get it to work in the tool. That might mean reorganizing some of the columns of data, adding in some additional columns with some calculation in it. I'm going to do a little bit of work to get the data into the right structure, and then I simply put it into a CSV format and upload it into the tool. So that's the easy bit done. Then we start to sit down and write a template. As I said at the start, we started this project with an idea that in order to get the speed of throughput, to try to produce enough of this content, this needed to be a journalist activity. This wasn't a cooperative coder project. This needed to be someone like myself, who'd never touched any of this, I can't code, to actually open this tool and sit down and write the story in a templated form. This is harder than writing a story. This takes considerably longer than writing a story and can be something of a mind bomb as you try and work out what every eventuality of the story might be that you're going to have to try to cover. So typically it'll take me a whole day to write a story, or maybe longer, maybe a day and a bit. In this one about obesity, there were some significant different story angles depending upon the areas. So in some areas, there was a significant difference in childhood obesity levels depending upon the social background of the children. So children from very deprived backgrounds had much, much higher levels of obesity than children from affluent backgrounds. So to us, that sounded like, for that area, that's probably the nose of the story. In other areas, it was about the rapid growth, excuse the word, in obesity levels and rates. So the rate changes the story for some areas. That's the nose of the story. For others, it's just the scale of the problem. And for some, it's the fact that there isn't really a problem. This area is bucking a national trend and does not have a rising level of childhood obesity, which most places in the country. So I've got 4 or 5 different starting points for these stories. And so you'll see along the left-hand side, I've got 4 or 5 different branch templates before I even start, each which will be triggered by a number I identify. So if this is a significant level of this, go this way. And if it's this, then go that way. And I'm still doing a branching template, so I'm writing 5 or 6 different stories at the same time. And with each of them, I'm able to push in the data from the data sheet as we go. So that process for ourselves and for the AP, a very similar process of trying to think what all the stories may be. So it's very different from writing one story.
And I forget if I mentioned this term, I'm just going to interrupt real quick because Gary mentioned it. It's often called branch writing. I don't know if I exactly said that before, but it can be called template writing, automated writing, but it is often called branch writing because that's essentially what you're doing. You're identifying the spot where, you know, if this, then that, and you build from there the branches of language. So I just wanted to throw that in because I think if this is an area that you're interested in, you will probably hear that term quite often.
So any sentence you write might have different outcomes, and the outcomes of that sentence affect how you're going to start the next sentence. So you have to try and work all those in. And so we're trying to do that as a form of writing now. As we go, we preview and check our work along the way. How's that working out? How's that computation working? Is it producing good copy? Is that working? So we're able to do that and check as we go along the way. And then when we're happy, we do a rigorous checking system, like Lisa's QA. We're checking at 3 levels. We're checking that the work we've done in the tool, that the functions we built in the tool are all operating correctly. We're looking at the previewed copy, and we're taking samples and going back to the original data set to check that our numbers are right. we found that quite a lot of the error happens not because of the automated writing, but because of manual handling of the data. So we're going back checking that. And then there's a simple thing like, we're reading the copy to make sure we're putting out a good story. This is going out on an agency wire. It's got to be fit to print. So we're trying to generate a good story for all our customers. And this was the result of that story, a sample of how that ran across a whole series of local titles in the UK. For some people, they take our copy and they run with it as it is. So we send out a rounded, formed story. For others, they use it as the base to build their story, to build a better, stronger local story, chasing local reactions, getting some additional context, and building something greater out of it. We're an agency. We're happy either way. What we're trying to do is give them something to work with, to fill a space that they weren't able to fill, to save time for their journalists, maybe to allow one of their journalists to go off and do something else while we do this for them.
Gary touched on the notion of errors in data, and this is definitely something we want to spend a lot of time talking about. I don't know if you can see this. This is my poor screenshot of a tweet, but this happened about a year ago, and it was, caused a lot of laughs in the automation circles, which, we're a funny bunch. But anyway, there had been a tweet about an earthquake, and it turned out that the original source, USGS, of the earthquake data had mistakenly put out information about an earthquake that happened in 1925. Well, the robot doesn't know that the USGS had just put out incorrect information, so it dutifully produced an alert about an earthquake that was wrong. But it's not wrong because the robot did something bad. It was wrong because USGS did something wrong. So, and there were all kinds of funny responses about, let's hope the robot doesn't get fired, and oh, we need to console the robot, and all that kind of stuff. But anyway, I mean, your automated stories are only as good as the data that is going into them. I mean, that's really the point of what I'm talking about. And when I said earlier that our data partner at Zacks Investment Research, that it's their human staff inputting the data, that in fact has been the issue. I mean, whenever we have had errors in automated stories, it's because somebody at Zacks inputted the wrong data, not because the software itself did something wrong. So, it's really, it's important. The data piece of this is so crucial. I mean, arguably, even more, way more than the automation tool or, that process, or like if you don't have data and a system set up to handle when there are mistakes, inevitably, then you're going to have inaccurate stories out there. And we've learned some things along the way. And but anyway, that's I just wanted to make that point that what we say is that our error rate on earnings stories has actually gone down since we automated. Now, mostly that's because software does not make typos and software does not make math errors. So, like you're writing a story and you do the math wrong and oops, you have to correct it. Well, the robot will never do that, so that's on the plus side. But you do, of course, have inevitably errors of data input that are a result of the human inputting the data, or in the case of the USGS, it's just a mistake. So anyway, just a word about that. Finally, we want to talk a little bit about a really interesting area. In fact, I think Gary and I were surprised at how much we talked about this yesterday. It's kind of fascinating. I think a lot of media companies struggle with, and really we all have to make our own decisions about what are the ethical considerations about being transparent about our use of these tools? When we were doing this and building this system back in 2014, we worked very closely with AP's standards editor on both the actual writing of the templates, because it was really important to us that the stories be in AP style and read like AP stories. They could not read like a machine was involved in it. And so that in and of itself was something that, the standards editor was very much involved in. But then also the discussion about disclosure. And, there was a belief at that time that remains true today that we want to be transparent about the fact that we have used these automation tools to create this story. And also, of course, that we're getting the data from a particular source. I mean, that's part of the disclosure as well. So at the bottom of every single automated earnings story, there is a disclosure line that talks about, that we created this story using automated insight software with data from Zacks Investment Research. And Gary at Herbs, they have really deployed a completely different philosophy, and I just think it's so interesting. So talk about that.
So when we started this, we talked to the people who we were going to deliver the stories to. This is the leading news groups across the UK. And we explained the process, what we're doing, as I've explained it here to you today. And we sort of left it to them whether they wanted to expose that to their readers or not. Nearly all of them have chosen not to do that. But what they have done is they have often carried the byline of the reporter who wrote the template. Because all our stories are traced back to a human action of a reporter who sat down and wrote the story, but wrote it in a templated form. So we will always attach the template writing reporter's byline to our stories, and they go out at the top of agency copy. And as with most agency copy, some of those bylines get used, some of those bylines don't get used, and some of them are shared as a local reporter works with that agency copy and does more with it in the way that they do with any form of agency copy. So you'll see there we have a standardized name and data reporter byline which we attach to our stories, and we turn up in all sorts of publications across the UK because of that. But we wanted that transparency about it. But ultimately, we are not consumer-facing. We are a business-to-business agency, and it's up to the publication that is consumer-facing to make a decision about that. What we wanted was just transparency about that decision-making.
See, I think this is such an interesting area for me because, and it gets back to what I said at the beginning. I make a point of saying, the robot didn't write this story. AP journalists or Herbs journalists or radar journalists wrote the story, and so I just think it's so, we did not carry that through to the natural conclusion that, well, whoever wrote that template should get the byline on the story. But in hearing Gary talk about it, it makes perfect sense. And I think it's, something for us that we'll have to, consider going forward. In reality, it's unlikely that we at AP would put a byline on a 130-word earnings story anyway, so it's a little bit of a non-issue. But I do think that the discussion of what does the reader expect? Does it matter to the reader to know that a story was created using automation software versus the traditional way? I just think that that's a really interesting question that will sort of evolve as more and more media organizations get into this kind of thing. But again, it's very clear. The authorship is with the human reporter who decided the structure of the story, the exact phrasing. It really is not the robot. So that's all for the formal presentation. Both of us love talking about this stuff to probably a ridiculous degree. So if anyone has questions or if you all have experience with these tools, and please ask us.
Hi, I must have missed the part, but when you before you publish the templated and the one piece that made into article, you said you will go through a check phase. Is that phase also automated, or is it a manual process?
For us, all the check phases are manual. A check of the original data, a check of the computation within the software that generated the template, and a check of the copy to make sure that the copy reads well enough to be sent out. So those are human journalist manual checks for us.
Yeah, I mean, for us, we're not doing exactly what Gary's doing. We are much more automating. I mean, if we're producing 3,700 earnings stories, it's essentially the same story with just different companies and different results. So that testing and check process we go through once, and then, you know, other than spot checks and reviews and things like that from time to time. And yes, all of that is very much manual, done by humans. I think he had a question, and then.
Hi, it's Ben Walsh, University of Northampton. Obviously, this is an area that's developing quite fast at the moment. What should we be teaching our students about automated writing? What sort of things do they need to know about it?
Ooh, it's a good question, Matt.
Well, I'm sorry, I can tell you that, I don't know if you may be already familiar with this, but there are a couple of programs that I know about in the States that where, especially the business journalism program at University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, does teach automated writing in one of its business journalism classes, and we ourselves are actually working with the University of Missouri journalism program to develop some coursework around automated writing, because, you know, not that it's going to revolutionize, you know, the industry, but it is a tool, you know, especially for journalists who are interested in business reporting, sports reporting, or, you know, I mean, I do think that this will grow beyond those key areas as it becomes more of a data-driven world. And so I do think having a basic understanding of what template writing is, and, you know, the idea that they might be expected to do that one day, I mean, certainly at least that. But like I said, I mean, there are cases where journalism programs are already working automated writing into their programs, so I would definitely, I can give you a contact name at UNC Chapel Hill if you're interested, and we can, okay.
I would like to think that the skills are just the skills that a journalist uses every day, and this will just be another thing a journalist is able to do. 2 years ago, I'd never written a template, and I taught myself to do this, and I'm quite a good benchmark. If I can learn to do it, then nearly everyone can. And I think that most journalists coming out of journalism school now have some basic competency with data, so that's a good starting point. And if you've got good writing skills, then you need to translate those to writing in template form. And if you've got good story identification skills, then you'll pick the right story to write about. So I think it's about core journalism skills, and it's about adding one more tool usage to that skill set. As Lisa says, I think we'll get a point where, yes, so I can do sports writing, I can do magazine writing, I can do hard news, breaking news story writing. Oh, I can also do branch writing. It's going to be one of those just skill set things that journalists will learn how to do, I think, sometime in the future, because I think it will become more commonplace.
I think, oh okay.
Hello. Could you elaborate a bit more on how, you know, your audience, how did your audience react to your automated stories?
I mean, a couple of things on that. As a news agency, our audience is other media outlets. You know, we don't really, unfortunately, we don't really have much experience of knowing what the end consumer thinks about the story. In general, our media customers, see, remember, going from 300 earnings stories to 3,700 means they're getting many more stories than they got before, so that makes them happy. Especially if you're a local media outlet, let's say you're the Dallas Morning News, and now suddenly you're getting way more earnings stories about companies in Texas than you did before. So that's a good thing. So in general, there was a very positive response. I mean, one thing that we did hear, and still do a lot, and it's absolutely an issue, gee, hey, it's great that we're getting an earnings story about, you know, these companies, but wow, like they're really basic. Like it would be great if the stories were better. You know, and my response to that is, yes, it would be great if the stories were better. But I mean, one of the things we're very conscious of is, you know, the more data and the more levels of context or information or whatever that you provide in that automated story, the slightly more complicated it gets. And I think, certainly back in 2014, this was a brave new world, and we really weren't sure, how it was going to work. We are actually right now going through, I call it Earnings 360. We're going through a thorough review of our earnings project, where we're looking at everything from our data sourcing to how we write the templates to, what the headlines say to what our workflow is. I mean, technology's changed in 3 years, obviously, since we started doing this. And so we decided it was time to kind of take a fresh look and see if we can actually make the stories better. Now, it's not our audience necessarily, but the companies that receive an automated earnings story, we have that same mixed reaction. Many are really happy to have an earnings story where they had nothing before, and some are really, really aggravated at how simple they are because they don't believe it gives the full context of what's going on with their companies. And it does not, and we don't pretend that it does. I mean, these are meant to be a very basic snapshot in time. So, I mean, that's what I can say about that.
I'm a little bit interested in the workflow. How many stories are still being reported by beat reporters from the earnings stories? And are there some alarm filters if some metrics change quite a lot that the beat reporters can follow up?
Yeah, so I'll say a couple things about that. I'm going to go back to I don't know if you can see this Excel spreadsheet very well, but oh, okay, it's not up anymore. Never mind. I'm seeing the PowerPoint, but you are not. No, so never mind. So, so I'll answer your question. So there are 80 to 100 companies that are the biggest global consumer brands. So Apple, Google, Walmart, those kinds of companies that we still have beat reporters every quarter writing an earnings story. Then we have a second group of another 100 to 150 stories that our editors will kind of keep an eye on, looking to see if that company made news, or if there's some news that needs to be added to the automated earnings story. And so we actually create what the Excel spreadsheet would have showed you is that we have a column called AP priority because we assign priority tiers to the universe of companies. So, and that actually serves a couple of purposes. If it's a priority 1 company, that means it's Apple or Google or one of those big companies that we're actually going to be covering. We're on the earnings call, we're doing the pre-reporting. I mean, we're doing all those things that any business journalist would do in covering a company on their beat. The second purpose of the tiering is that the system, if you know anything about earnings season, there are days when hundreds and hundreds of companies report on the same day and sometimes at the same time. So you need to tell the system, if you're creating 50 earnings stories at a time, which one do you send to the wire first? Well, we want it sending the important big company story first and leaving the smaller company to the end. So that's the other purpose of creating the priority tiers. I do want to talk a little bit more about this issue of what my business news reporters do with earnings stories. One of the things also that automation allowed us to do, in addition to freeing up time to do other things, is it allowed us to change our entire approach to reporting on these companies, where I, as business news editor, would say to my reporters, you no longer have to focus on producing that story in the first 20 minutes that says what Microsoft earned, or what Apple earned. I don't want you to worry about that. I want you to think about what is the most interesting thing about this company that we can tell people about right now. And maybe that means it's a new product that it's rolling out. Maybe it's a new business that they're getting into. Maybe it's Facebook that's having all sorts of problems with regulators. Hard to believe, but it happens. Maybe that's the focus of the story. and it just happens to include earnings. But let's change our approach from reporting on numbers, which, you know, I mean, how long after those numbers are out does it lose its value? The market has digested it, investors have digested it, readers have digested it. Let's think differently about the kinds of things we're saying about our big important companies that everyday readers care about. So, I mean, that's another kind of untold, uncelebrated advantage of automation, is that not only did it free up all this time to go do other things, it allowed us to really be way more creative and contextual in covering the companies that we do care about. So anyway, longer answer than you expected probably, but so that's what I'd say about all of that. And I'm sorry, do you want to say anything more about that?
No, I think you've got that covered.
I'm very passionate about that, as you can tell.
What has been one of the biggest difficulties or challenges you've had with automative writing, and is there anything that is translation hard? Like if you're translating or that kind of thing, have you faced problems with that?
Could you explain what you mean by translation? Do you mean working in multiple languages?
Yeah.
We don't currently work in multiple languages.
And we don't either.
But some of the tools will work in different languages.
Yeah.
In terms of the biggest challenges, I think it's just learning the skill base of writing in a different way. If all the journalists in this room go back to the first time they ever sat down and write a news story, they probably found it quite a difficult and traumatic experience of trying to work out, have I got the right line at the top here? Have I got the right narrative through this story? And it's a bit like going back to start and learning that process all again, and learning to write in a different and, to be frank, unusual way. And so that's just a learning process. And so we're a few months into that, and we're getting better at what we do all the time. And I suppose if there's a challenge or a frustration, it's can I produce 400 versions of a story to the quality that I would want to be able to produce one if I just sat down with one set of numbers and wrote one story? Can I get that translation right? And that's the big challenge, and I think. But I think that's just an experience and learning curve challenge.
So, and I'll say a couple of things. We have not done anything with other languages, and AP does have a Spanish language and Arabic language service. But we've had conversations with Automated Insights about this. We would probably not translate the automated earnings stories, but what we would do is actually write the templates in a different language. You wouldn't add another layer of machine learning translation, which would possibly be wrong. Instead, you'd have native speakers who are journalists write the templates in that language, and you would do it that way. So, I mean, that's highly possible. We just have not done that. In terms of difficulty, I'd say one of the great advantages, in a way, that Gary has is that this is all they're doing. I mean, they're creating automated stories from data, and that's a wonderful thing. For us, this is one of about 100 things we're doing. I mean, we're covering the economy and technology and retail and global and trade wars and, and doing investigative work and, everything else. And so managing the workflow of the automated project, integrating that into everything else we're doing throughout our day can be a challenge, and you learn over time how to kind of design the right procedures for how you're going to handle it. An example of that is, another beauty of automation is that many of our earnings stories are now out to the wire within 5 minutes of the company reporting. I can promise you that my human reporters could never get a story written and published on the wire in 5 minutes. So speed is also an advantage of automated writing. Well, there are times when the system bogs down, and maybe it's on Zach's, our data partner's end, maybe it's on the robot's end, maybe it's on our end, the pipes, and my editor will be sitting there like, okay, where's the robot? And so like they've got to chase down where the story is, and so there's little things like that that happen that you have to plan for and understand and learn how to work it, through your day. And so I would say you know, that's the kind of thing, you know, it's just a thing. You know, you have to work through all of these little details. But I wouldn't say we'd had difficulties per se. It's just been more like, in fact, I would say the system worked way better than we thought it would, which is probably a testament to the amount of months we spent testing, because we were so terrified, you know, that it wouldn't go well. But now it's more like just kind of working through the little kinks of keeping the data up to date, you know, managing who do you call if the story's not out within the first 10 minutes, you know, those kinds of things.
I have one short follow-up question. Did you think about semi-automatization to give the earning reports more context, more color, better titles?
Now tell me what you mean by semi-automation.
That you have one part written by the robot and one part written by a human.
So in practicality, that's a little bit of what we do. Often for some of those priority companies that I mentioned, our reporters or our editors will grab the automated story and add to it. What we haven't done, we have not pre-written context paragraphs or that then gets merged with the automated story. Like, I mean, we haven't formalized that process, but I think the reporters have come to view the automated story as their baseline to take and then write through. So that's how we've done it.
So, question about other robots. In other words, voice-activated robots like Siri and Alexa. Are either of you doing work on voice-activated journalism, and if so, what can you divulge?
We're not currently, but what I would say is the very large amount of very localized news that we're producing might sit very comfortably in a voice assistant. Tell me what happened in the neighborhood, Alexa.
So AP does have, Amazon and Google Home and those companies are customers of ours. Our AP produces what's called story summaries for all of its news stories that are essentially two-sentence description, you know, two-sentence summaries of the news story. And those, we're working with Amazon and others to basically, you know, what's the news, Alexa? And Alexa will read AP summaries.
What's the news of this stock company result?
Oh, I should say that that's being done for AP's top news product. It's actually not being done yet for earnings stories. We haven't quite made it there yet, but we will. All right, I think we're out of time?
We're out of time.
Yeah, we are.
Okay.
Right now.
Okay. Thank you all for
Okay.
coming.
I'm going to sit out there for a few minutes, so if anyone has more questions,
Yeah,
I'm
come
happy
talk to us.
Thank you. Excellent job, co-presenter.